Lawabha. In the life of Priscilla Jean and in the life of Kurt Hein, all things begin and end with God. Praised be God, glorified be God, exalted is He. What a privilege to be able to say that. I first want to express my appreciation to my wife, Delane, and to my father, who's 6'4". Only I want to express something other than appreciation to my father. Simply for the height. Who has contributed to my thinking on this particular topic, and who has been suffering the loneliness which my presence here today visits upon her, and which my services visit upon her on a regular basis. And I dedicate this brief moment today with you to her. I wish to express my appreciation to Glenn Afert, to Duncan Hanks, to Christine Zerbini, and the other dedicated, hard-working souls who have made this conference possible, and who, for your amusement, I think, invited me to be here. Most especially, I wish to express my appreciation to the emergent spiritual leaders among us. We aren't yet a community, as Mujan has clearly demonstrated to us in the North. But we have among us brothers and sisters from the Indian and black cultures who, by their heroic moral fortitude and by their shining example, are illumining our might, our powers, our capacities for self-reliance, our collective origins, and our collective destiny. And I want to thank these leaders for sharing with us what they have in terms of spiritual illumination to give to us who are their followers. I need to place the remarks I'm going to make in a context. And the first context is to tell you that I am from two lost tribes. The first lost tribe was of many clans. There was a clan from Saarland in western Germany on the border of France. In German, my name means home. In French, my name means I'm learning which one is the more real name. Very amusing. My tribe, my European tribe, the members of those clans to which I belong, but know nothing, almost nothing about, left their land over 100 years ago and emigrated to Wisconsin, Minnesota, Missouri, places like that, and ultimately to California. Having been born in California, I was born without much heritage from those clans. And this cultural costume I'm wearing today doesn't really fit me very well. I was preferring to come here in a t-shirt and jeans because I'm from California. But something there is that tells me that wouldn't have quite been well received if I had done so. But maybe one day I'll have that courage. And to be as noble in that dress as Kevin is in his. But I also belong to another tribe. And it's also a lost tribe. But it's only lost because it has not yet emerged. However, I do know who some of my forefathers and my ancestors are. I was taught about Baha'u'llah by Ray Pfluger, who was taught about Baha'u'llah by Claire Newport, who was taught about Baha'u'llah by Marvin Newport, who was in turn taught by a dentist in Wisconsin, who was in turn taught by Charlie Reimer, who was in turn taught by a woman whose name is Ruth Moffat. Ruth Moffat learned about the Baha'i faith by walking down the street in Chicago and seeing a picture of Abdu'l-Baha and going to his talk. So I am a great-grandchild of Abdu'l-Baha. And that's the tribe I'm coming to learn more about. And that's the tribe we're hoping to establish a universal identity of. And that's the tribe most of us share. I've just come here from, where was it? Yugoslavia, where I was about a week ago, addressing an international conference on culture and communication. And I was invited to share with that conference, which was not a Baha'i-sponsored conference by any stretch of the imagination, the Baha'i model. And when I got there, I said I will not share with them the Baha'i model of community radio. Rather, I will share with them the Baha'i experiments of community radio. We don't have a model. We do have processes, we do have principles, we do have struggles, we do have a workshop that we're working in, but we have no model. And I was able to say that because a week prior to going to Yugoslavia, I was in Peru. And in Peru, I was at a 2-week conference sponsored by the House of Justice through the International Baha'i Audiovisual Center to present to the staffs of the 7 Baha'i radio stations that now exist the opportunity to dialogue about what it is we're attempting to do with these radio stations. And I also wish to say to those groups to alert you to the beauty and the strength and the power of what those groups are doing and the incredible task they're facing as they attempt to apply in very concrete terms these principles. So the remarks I'm making to you today all evolve essentially out of the last 6 weeks of my frequent flyer program. What time am I supposed to finish? Is that tonight or is that tomorrow morning? The conference has chosen the theme cultural development, and it presumes upon us then an assumption about culture and about development, which we have all carried with us as we've walked into this meeting. And I want to say that unless we examine those assumptions, I fear that the dominant Western notions, which the majority of us carry in our heads, will come to typify what we're attempting to do, and therefore we will miserably attempt in achieving true cultural development. I won't restate in detail many of the things that have been said about the existing paradigm. The fact that the materialistic paradigm of development is the one that dominates, certainly in the social sciences, which is my training, my background academically. But very briefly said that we usually have materialistic theories of man that define culture in terms of ritual behavior and in terms of material artifacts, and that define development in terms of political behaviors and in terms of economic indices. The logical conclusion of this approach, of course, is self-interest. That the developed individual is one who has managed to create in his own life a means through which he maintains himself and achieves a certain level of material, economic, and political health and well-being. Therefore, civilization is a web of collective well-beings. Development is a product, then, in terms of the social scientists' work, of social engineering. Now, for Baha'is, the problem is that, as adequate as this definition might be for mechanistic processes, such as electronics, it does not adequately describe human behavior. Most particularly, it does not accommodate spiritual concepts. The existence of the soul, or for that matter, God, cannot be proven empirically, and therefore it is perforce discredited. For example, the concept of martyrdom to a materialist can only be regarded as mental illness. There is no basis for martyrdom in a materialistic philosophy other than sickness, illness, disease. Shoghi Effendi, in The Advent of Divine Justice and the Promised Day Has Come, portrayed the evidences of such an impoverished view of human nature, a view that has fed the fires of innumerable social calamities, currently afflicting not only our own culture, but spreading rapidly to all the cultures of the world. In 1949, his secretary wrote on his behalf, "What we Baha'is must face is the fact that society is disintegrating so rapidly that moral issues, which were clear a half-century ago, are now hopelessly confused." and what is more, thoroughly mixed up with battling political interests. I find it incredible to watch the whole issue about the right to life and see people doing sit-ins who were the people being sat against 20 years ago by my generation. It's a bizarre turn of events, the whole abortion issue. If you look at the degree to which that has become a political issue, and certainly not a moral issue. We may understand that a materialist view of culture and development is inadequate, but unless we have in our hearts and in our heads a clear alternative vision of what cultural development is and the basis and the premises upon which it is established, we will not be very good at conceiving new approaches. And in testimony to that fact, I invite you sometime to review the letters that are submitted to the Office of Social and Economic Development in Haifa to show you just how clearly we don't yet understand that we have a different view of development. Most of the Baha'i world immediately translates the 83 letter of the House of Justice to projects. And that's not what our understanding is of Baha'i cultural development, from my opinion. Perhaps nowhere in the Baha'i world are the concepts of culture and development more clearly articulated than in this book, The Secret of Divine Civilization. And whatever I don't say today and missay today, I encourage you to get a better glimmering of, or a much more clearer picture of what it is I'm trying to address by reading this book, The Secret of Divine Civilization by Abdu'l-Baha. I regard it as the textbook for social and economic development in the Baha'i community. And in fact, I think its influence is so powerful that future historians will find that the whole progress of Persia, the move from the feudal society that it was 100 years ago to what is now returning to the feudal society that it was but somewhere in between there were some attempts being made. And those attempts being made, in my humble opinion, found their origins in this work. It was written to people in Persia in 1875. But in my opinion, its principles are, of course, universal and timeless. In it, Abdu'l-Baha describes the processes that must be set in motion if we are to achieve cultural development, human development, civilization. He refers to this process as establishing new bases for human happiness, and therefore the title of this talk. I won't read the entire quote. It's on pages 3 and 4. But he says, it's so hard not to read. We should continually be establishing new bases for human happiness and creating and promoting new instrumentalities toward this end. So we're following the logic, okay? We're supposed to establish new bases of happiness. So now listen to where his logic proceeds. How excellent, how honorable is man if he arises to fulfill his responsibilities. How wretched and contemptible if he shuts his eyes to the welfare of society and wastes his precious life in pursuing his own selfish interests and personal advantages. Supreme happiness, new basis for human happiness, supreme happiness is man's, and he beholds the signs of God in the world and in the human soul if he urges on the steed of high endeavor in the arena of civilization and justice. Then a quote from the Quran, we will surely show them our signs in the world and within themselves. Abdu'l-Baha contrasts the conditions of Persia at that time to European civilization, material civilization, and he says to the Persian leaders, look at what's being done next door to you, and yet, and here's a phrase I coined that I really love, xenophobic insularity. What's that for? Xenophobic insularity. What it really means is they hate other people and they close their doors, okay? Abdu'l-Baha says, look at Europe. Look at the civilization that they've raised up over there. And here we are next door and we aren't even doing it. But then what's a little bit shocking is he goes on to say, even so, notwithstanding all this, the civilization that they've built, and I'll read his words, all the peoples of Europe, notwithstanding their vaunted civilization, sink and drown in this terrifying sea of passion and desire. And this is why all the phenomena of their culture come to nothing. It's page 60. I want to repeat that one. Talking about European civilization. All the phenomena of their culture come to nothing. It certainly would elicit indignation among Europeans of the 19th century, would it not, to hear that statement made, much less the 20th? He says, don't misunderstand what I'm saying, and I'm paraphrasing here. He said, don't be alarmed, don't be perturbed by what I'm saying. The reason for this is that the primary purpose, the basic objective in laying down powerful laws and setting up great principles and institutions dealing with every aspect of civilization is human happiness. And human happiness consists only in drawing closer to the threshold of the Almighty God and in securing the peace and well-being of every individual member, high and low alike, of the human race. And then he says the supreme agencies for accomplishing these two objectives, nearness to God and the happiness of every human being, the supreme agencies are the excellent qualities with which humanity has been endowed. New bases for human happiness. The excellent qualities with which humanity has been endowed. He makes it clear that the great failing of European culture, my lost tribe, my people, is that it has not used its vaunted material developments on behalf of human progress or nearness to God. He says a superficial culture, unsupported by a cultivated morality, and I love this next term, you artists in the audience, wow, listen to this one, is as a confused medley of dreams, the black canvas. An external luster without inner perfection is like a vapor in the desert, which the thirsty dreameth to be water. For results which would win the good pleasure of God and secure the peace and well-being of man could never be fully achieved in a merely external civilization. The peoples of Europe have not advanced to the higher planes of moral civilization, as their opinions and behavior clearly demonstrate. Any Indians or blacks in the audience who want to applaud this story? 75 years later, Shoghi Effendi, and I discovered in rereading this book, or studying this book really for the first time in depth, that all these ideas of Shoghi Effendi's that I've been inhaling for the last 15 years have a base, a foundation in this. What a surprise. I wonder who Shoghi Effendi's teacher was. According to my understanding, the basis of cultural development in the Baha'i teachings is moral action based on moral education. And I'm delighted to see that the topic following me is precisely that topic, moral education. For this is the very purpose of religion. Baha'u'llah stated that it is the object of every revelation to effect a transformation in the whole character of mankind. Abdu'l-Baha, when visiting Paris, said, unless the moral character of a nation is educated, civilization will have no basis. No basis. Abdu'l-Baha then, and I'm going to shorten up this whole next part of the paper, but half of this book, literally 60 pages of this book, are dedicated to one principle, one theme, one central thought. He addresses what's required then for establishing this moral civilization, and he says the primary responsibility in this work, the primary responsibility rests upon spiritual leadership, the spiritual leaders. Now in Persia, in the mid-19th century, the spiritual leaders were the ulama, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, the religious leaders of the community. Now, I suspect that Abdu'l-Baha knew that they didn't have any power. I suspect he knew, even in addressing them in this book, that the spiritual leaders he was addressing were not the ulama. I think it was merely the vehicle he used to teach us all about spiritual leadership. And that's my opinion. These were, after all, powerless clerics, powerless because they had rejected the Lord of the age. And Baha'u'llah gave them the opportunity, and when they did not respond, he withdrew all power and authority from those who had been the spiritual leaders of Islamic civilization. So I like to read this book as an admonishment to the divines, partly, but also to the leaders of the world, and most particularly to us, those of us who use the name Baha'i. In describing the attributes of the spiritually learned, then Abdu'l-Baha cites an Islamic tradition. And this is the heart and soul of the Secret of Divine Civilization to my reading. This one little paragraph, which isn't even from the Baha'i writings directly. It's Abdu'l-Baha taking an Islamic tradition. He says this tradition embodies all the conditions of learning. Moral education. All the conditions of learning. Quote, and this is the tradition. As for him who is one of the learned, he must guard himself. He must defend his faith. He must oppose his passions and obey the commands of his Lord. Four bases, in my interpretation, four bases for the development of culture, of human happiness. He must guard himself. Abdu'l-Baha says that this means he must acquire the attributes of spiritual and material perfection. He says you must have faith in God and have a knowledge of your own spiritual reality. And at the same time, then, he talks about the necessity of studying history, human history. Very interesting. I think Mujan's talk illuminated for us the value of history, of knowing our history in the context of our spiritual reality. And Abdu'l-Baha said this is point number one of the 4 points. Number 2, he must defend his faith. How? The whole population should be protected in every way. Every effort should be exerted to adopt a combination of all possible measures to raise up the Word of God, to increase the number of believers, to promote the faith of God and exalt it. Teach, teach, teach. And he says the way you teach is through human perfection. That's the most powerful instrument for teaching, the most powerful instrument for defending the faith. He must, third, oppose his passions. Abdu'l-Baha said the foundation of every laudable human quality is found in this notion of opposing your human passions, your material passions. He says this is the balance wheel of all behavior, the means of keeping all men's good qualities in equilibrium. It's in this section that he, slams Europe and goes on then to talk about the process by which the rulers of the world can create the universal peace by agreeing to come together and consult. Then the 4th principle of the foundation of human happiness is he must obey the commands of his Lord. The spiritually learned, the foundation stone of these new bases of human happiness, the elemental structural component, if you will, of cultural civilization, must obey the commands of his Lord. Abdu'l-Baha says nothing can be affected in the world. Nothing can be affected in the world, not even conceivably. We can't even conceive of the possibility without unity and agreement. And the perfect means for engendering fellowship and union is true religion. My understanding then of the secret of divine civilization, the secret in the book, is that there are 4 things that we must be doing to assume the station of spiritual leadership upon which civilization is built. And these 4 things are faith, teaching, spiritual growth, and obedience. The spiritual foundations of cultural development. From this point, then, we have the Baha'i administrative order. We take these bricks, if you will, these spiritual leaders, and we bring them together, and we put them in the spirit of consultation. And each contributes through consultation and through its divinely ordained institutions of local spiritual assemblies to build then the structures that the Baha'u'llah has ordained for the new civilization. And I talk a bit in the paper about what that is. And allow me, if you will, a few more minutes to share with you a few examples. Okay, the first example is Abdu'l-Baha himself. Abdu'l-Baha was no mere prophet, obviously. His proof was his life. That's why he's the exemplar of these four qualities of spiritual leadership. A second proof is the fact that we now have 30,000 assemblies, roughly, in over 120,000 communities, in over 150 countries around the world. That's no mean feat in 150 years. But we must, it seems to me, remember that that's a historical anomaly. This whole process of the last several decades of pioneering and the plans put forth by Shoghi Effendi to establish the faith in all these corners of the world is historically an anomaly. It won't be the process of Baha'i civilization. It will be the structure. So what we see now in terms of the development of the administrative order is very temporal. And we're only the cradle in North America. These twin communities, Canada and the U.S., are only the cradle of the administrative order. So we have a very short span of time in which our influence is going to be spread through the world. And it's my opinion as I travel that this is primarily already essentially accomplished. And the fourth epoch to me means time for the folks out there, the 90% of the Baha'i world community who are not represented by us here in the room, to take it forward. If you want to see examples, if you want to know, in my opinion, the Baha'i faith's experience, you have to go to the villages. 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 If you can't go in your body, go in your heart. If you can't go on a jet plane, go on the books of Baha'u'llah. If you can't go to Nicaragua, look next to you in your own Baha'i community, to the Hmong believer who doesn't speak English, and ask, is there something I could be doing? If you're worried about the hungry children in Ethiopia, look to the Persian woman in your community who doesn't understand a word of English or French, and ask yourself, is there something I can be doing to feed this soul? The best example we have of development, in my understanding so far, of how this process that Abdu'l-Baha talks about works is the Iranian community itself. Here was a community that lost all its leadership to genocide. Who were the martyrs? They were the leaders of the Baha'i and the Baha'i communities. So who was left after the martyrdom, after that terrible pogrom? In the middle 19th century, we were told more than 20,000 of our tribe were killed. Who was left? Nobody of any material stature. They were diseased, they were poor, they were illiterate, they were uneducated. But through these few tablets of, my God, they didn't have anything like this. They didn't have anything like any of the writings that we have available to us today. They had one or two tablets that had been shared among them. And these were among illiterate people who had no education, no training, no letters behind their name. But from their own spiritual response to the revelation, they established hospitals, tutorial schools, charitable works. Within 2 generations, the Baha'i community, these villages in Iran, were among the most outstanding, the cleanest, the most hospitable, the most honorable, the most trustworthy communities in that society. Even though the people themselves hated these heretics, they could not deny the fact that these were the honest members of the community. So even though I may hate this Baha'i over here, I will entrust in him my children for education and my money for investment, because I sure as hell can't trust my next door neighbor. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? Many of the first, in this country where 15% of the women were literate, do you know the percentage of literacy among the Baha'i women, as has been reported to me? 100%. 100%. And those Persians of you in the audience, your parents and your grandparents, were not members of the court of the Shah. Were they? They're villagers, aren't they? Same thing is happening among the pygmies in Zaire. There's some wonderful stories I would like to share with you, but I won't. I'm already over. On the Truk Islands in the Pacific, there's similar stories of believers who are having copra as their main cash crop, but they used to have a middleman who took most of the profits. So then the Peace Corps came in and helped them establish a cooperative. But after the Peace Corps volunteer left, the agent for the cooperative ran away with the money. So the Baha'is came in and tried to establish it. And why have they been successful in establishing a cooperative that works? Is it because of their material training? Is it because of their bookkeeping and accounting system? It's because of their trustworthiness. It's because of their spiritual attributes. It's because they are spiritual leaders of their communities. In Western Panama, a friend of mine, Federico, was very concerned that he saw the Guaymi peoples forgetting their language and their dances and their music. And there was a dance called the Sabanero that he knew the old people used to do. He remembered as a child seeing it. It's a powerful dance. Don't know if you've ever seen it. I had the privilege of dancing in one recently. It's marvelous. So Federico, a Baha'i, a young man, 18, 19 years old, went to the elder and said, I want to learn the Sabanero. And the old man said, oh yeah? Oh, you do, huh? And he said, well, if you want to learn the Sabanero, you must first learn the language of the Sabanero. A different language entirely. So that you will know what you're saying when you dance. And so he learned the language of the Sabanero, and now Federico has taught the Sabanero to his people, has taught the Sabanero to people in Venezuela and Colombia and Peru, and has reestablished this powerful force for unifying the hearts and souls of the members of his community, has reestablished that tradition in his home. At the Baha'i radio station in South Carolina, the individuals there are gathering together this week to deepen together, to pray together, to study the covenant together, and then, only after then, to talk about how they're going to screen the lyrics of the records that they play over the station. We've talked for as long as that station's been on the air about screening the lyrics. Any of you who listen to pop music know what I'm referring to. But you cannot overlay a methodology without a foundation of principle. I cannot screen lyrics unless I have in my heart a balance, a standard, a screen through which to screen those lyrics. And so it's very exciting for me to be at the radio station and have, well, you saw Laura Shell, the jazz lady, child of sharecroppers in Mississippi, to have Bob Brown, himself a tobacco cropper before getting into radio, to have Ernie, who's from the village right down the road, to have these folks studying the Word of God, talking together, making collective decisions about programming that is going to influence 800,000 people in their community. These are the decision makers. And to the degree that they mirror these four attributes, they will be effective. They will be the spiritual leaders of their community. I'd like to close with a few words of Shoghi Effendi. We are indeed living in an age which, if we would correctly appraise it, should be regarded as one which is witnessing a dual phenomenon. The first signalizes the death pangs of an order effete and godless that has stubbornly refused, despite the signs and portents of a century-old revelation, to attune its processes to the precepts and ideals which that heaven-sent faith proffered it. The second proclaims the birth pangs of an order, divine and redemptive, that will inevitably supplant the former, and within whose administrative structure an embryonic civilization, incomparable and world-embracing, is imperceptibly maturing. The one is being rolled up and is crashing in oppression bloodshed, and ruin. The other opens up vistas of a justice, a unity, a peace, a culture such as no age has ever seen. The former has spent its force, demonstrated its falsity and barrenness, lost irretrievably its opportunity, and is hurrying to its doom. The latter, virile and unconquerable, is plucking asunder its chains and is vindicating its title to be the one refuge within which a sorely tried humanity, purged from its dross, can attain its destiny. Ya Baha'u'llah.